Thanks for coming to the talk here. Hopefully it'll be useful for you. It's useful for me to talk with y'all. I was pretty cold earlier, but it's so warm in here now. I think I'll be excessively cold or warm by the time we're out of here. Anyhow, as the presentation says here, what I'm going to go over is a methodology that has been in use for many years, mostly with larger organizations, but to look through the portfolio of tens, if not hundreds of applications that they have, and figure out how to modernize them, how to make them more fit for purpose. And as we'll get into, there's various reasons why you'd want to modernize the apps you have. But essentially, I think judging from the people who are here, you kind of know what legacy applications are, and we'll get into that as well. But I think it can be very difficult for organizations to figure out which ones to modernize, what to do, and how to go about it. So let's start off by going to the beach here, because I'm cold, so I'm going to think of that. But this is kind of an example of thinking about why you would care about modernizing your legacy software and having a methodological approach to it. And that is, let's imagine that we're working at, I don't know, a large insurance company or something. Like a lot of insurance companies, we've been around for 50, 100 years or more or so, right? And we've been pretty good about figuring out all of the, well, I don't know, money, the business that we could go out there and get. We're insuring cars and houses and people and trips and, I don't know, liability, all sorts of fun stuff like that. So we want to make more money. I mean, most businesses are in the business of making more money, retaining customers, you know, essentially increasing what they're selling. So we have this idea that we're going to enter this this sort of like 24-hour insurance market. Nowadays, this isn't so much a problem with phones, but I remember one time I went to the beach back when I was in Texas. We went over to Alabama on the Gulf, and I was having a great time with my kids, and I sat down in the water with them and played, and then I got up a few hours later and I realized I'd ruined my phone because I sat right down there in the ocean water with it, which wasn't very good at. So I might have wanted to buy some insurance for that day, definitely days afterwards, because I knew I would do this again, or think maybe I would. And, you know, at the time, it wasn't really possible to just sort of like go online and insure my phone for 24 hours. Like that's a whole sort of like different type of business that an insurance company would get into. Nowadays, it's kind of common, but if you cast your mind back to those old days 3 years ago or so, you can imagine that if you're an insurance company and you kind of get this idea, you get really hungry because this is a huge new source of revenue. And really, there's not that many people that frequently that are going to be a little unmindful like me and sit down with their phone in the water, right? So insurance is a great business. It's basically pretty much free money that you're getting from people, which I'm reminded of every year when I pay my life insurance premium. But, you know, let's say, so you have this idea, you go to the developers, and you know, I used to be an application developer before I worked on slides. And this is basically how long anything takes for a developer, right? You might ask them, you know, we just need to add one page here, and someone's going to tell us what type of phone they have, and then we'll basically make a quick call to the back end and set up that insurance for them, and it's going to take about 15 minutes or so. You know, we might need to go get lunch, and I'm probably going to have to do some boxes and arrows diagramming, but it's not really that big of a deal. And so you get really excited. You're like, that's great. We're going to make some more money. Good old Coté here is going to be able to sit down on the water with his phone and maybe get a new one, although as a business, we hope that doesn't happen. We'd rather just get his money. But then the developers sit down, they're like, all right, well, first of all, let's figure out this back end here. You know, we got to go, we're an insurance company, so somewhere we've got scurrying around what our entire book of insurance is, right? You can't really like sell more insurance than you could potentially pay out. That would not be a cool situation. And then we might also want to go to our sort of risk analysis service and kind of, we've got this guy coming to us. He's in his early 40s, so he's probably a good bet, like probably responsible. And we need to kind of look up the risk profile and therefore how much we might charge them. And then we also need to go to our security people because we're going to be collecting customer data and entering new things. And on and so forth, right? And you know, you can imagine that in a sort of more modern approach of doing things, kind of like the presentation that you just saw, which is telling you how to do a bunch of remote calls, and whether you use gRPC or REST or GraphQL, if you had these great APIs, maybe it would only take you 15 minutes to just make make a quick call over there and use them. But often what you find is like, I don't know, I've got to go interface with an ERP system now. And I've heard about this thing called like COBOL that we wrapped some sort of like facade around. But I kind of need to understand this weird format of calling back to checking on the book. And then it turns out like I've got to have everything in caps with underscores when I'm doing it. And it hasn't been converted over to Unicode yet, so I've got to use, and it also turns out that it's like a Swiss system, so I've got to use that character set. And on and on and on, right? Like you encounter the sort of signs of these systems that haven't been updated in a while, and it's definitely going to take you longer than 15 minutes to add this new feature in here. And then I'm not going to be able to give you money to sit in the ocean with my phone, which is going to be a bummer. But again, kind of good if I did sit in the ocean, because then you wouldn't be making enough money. But this is the kind of situation that comes up over and over again. I'm sure at your organizations, you don't have this problem and everything takes 15 minutes. But when you're talking to your friends and they're a little upset about things, you can be more sympathetic to their situation. And indeed, you know, if you look at surveys, right, this comes up in businesses over and over again that rely on software, right? So a huge proportion, I mean, I think this is pretty huge, of companies, as represented by executives talking about things, say that they're in this situation where, you know, what should just take 15 minutes is going to take much longer, and they're really being held back and evolving their business by the software that they have, the old legacy software that they have in place. So this is a huge issue, legacy software. It's kind of like, by its very nature, it's kind of like a creeping, well, I guess it kind of is creeping, but it's kind of like a hidden, underappreciated thing. Now, what's fun about this situation, and kind of the closer to the code you are, the more that you're that person who wishes something would be 15 minutes, you tend to actually be very aware of the legacy problems that you have. But somehow going above the developer team, that knowledge kind of disappears. And there's kind of like not a very good way for the organization as a whole to think about managing the legacy software. You could think of it as tech debt, although that's slightly different sort of thing there. But part of what I'm going to go over, in addition to the methodology to use this, is a way to kind of make the rest of the organization aware of this and show the importance and of addressing legacy software, but also like trying to figure out a way to kind of like express that to the rest of the organization so they understand why things take much longer than 15 minutes, even though they may seem simple. So first of all, this is me, if you can't tell. I'm wearing a different shirt. I work at VMware. I've been there for about 8 years or so. I started at Pivotal, and VMware acquired Pivotal. I'm lucky to be on this developer advocate team where we spend a lot of time working with developers and kind of seeing what's going on out in the world. Now, I'm a bit of a weird person on this team. Well, my role is different than the other ones. I don't really, despite, you know, days like today, I don't really talk with developers very much, nor advocate for them so much, as talk about these kind of more strategic and managerial, architectural sort of concerns that are going on, and how organizations, when they want to get better at software, the changes that they go through, sort of like the way they think through that process. You know, a lot of people would call that culture or something, but it's more of the kind of how are you doing the process of software and improving it. And I've been lucky to write about 3 books or so kind of on that topic as I talk with organizations, and I do a few podcasts, and I've worked at various other places. Anyhow, if you're interested in, as my friend says, engaging with my brand, it's pretty easy to do so. Now, what I'm going to go over, there's me again. I wrote this book last year with one of my friends and coworkers, Marc Zotter. That's the other one. And it's, you know, it's about, I don't know, it's a very short book. Let's say about 50, 80 pages. Almost the perfect size for a book. I always am trying to find some interesting book to read when I'm going to sleep, and they're so long. Like maybe if there was a shorter one that would get to the point sooner. I guess what I need is a novella. So you could think of this as a novella about the exciting world of application modernization. You can get that for free if you're interested, you know, there. But a lot of the I wanted to go over this because Marc is really the more knowledgeable, smart one of the two of us. Who, you know, if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have been able to really write this book. I just got a chance to hang out with him and type some. So this is basically in one slide what I'm going to go over. So if you want to read this really quick, and you need to go use the toilet or you're hungry, you can leave after this. This will give you everything you need to know. But what we're going to end up arriving at is this methodology that, and by we, I don't mean me at all. I just mean the organization I work at Pivotal and now VMware. This methodology that we've come up with, I think over the past 10 years or so, called the SWIFT methodology. Not to be confused with banking, the SWIFT banking or anything like that, or other SWIFT things. I don't really know what other SWIFT things would be. But you can see as we go through this, and I'll go over it in more detail, it's a very sort of like disciplined approach to figuring out which applications you should modernize based on the capabilities that you need, what your organization does with them, how valuable those applications are to what your organization is doing, and then breaking up these applications into little domains and clusters of kind of workflows through them, and then based on the, let's say, feasibility of changing them and the value that those applications will have once you modernize them, you select those applications, you select little slices to modernize, and you like week by week systematically go through and modernize them, kind of learning along the way of not only how you're modernizing or rewriting those applications, but how the changes in your organization that need to occur, how it can actually happen in the organization. So it's a very iterative learning-based way of going about things that we've done with, I don't know, hundreds of different organizations, definitely thousands of applications over the past 10 or so years. So first, let's sort of get an idea. I mean, as I was saying earlier, I think we all in here probably kind of intuitively know what legacy software is. But let's go over a couple of definitions just to have a nice baseline of it. Now, here's a lengthy definition from Ann Thomas. She works at Gartner. She's one of the, I've followed her for many years. She does great work. She's one of the people who, way back in the 2000s, if you were alive back then, she kind of spearheaded and kind of thought out service-oriented architectures and WS star stuff. Now like all great ideas in computers, eventually that kind of became gigantic when other things came along. But at the time, it was fantastic. It was a really good way of orienting the way you were doing APIs and dividing things up. But you can see that she's got a pretty good kind of overview of what legacy software is. And what's tied there, again, and this is a point that I'm going to make over and over again, is not only the technical value of it, but also the value to the organization, right? Like, to some extent, if everything is going okay with these, those old all caps underscore programs, and the organization's functioning fine, then like maybe it's not legacy code. Maybe it's just dandy and peachy, right? Now, there's a more sort of like technical, overly clever definition from Michael Feathers. It has a great book from the early 2000s that legacy code is code without unit test, which, that's fun. If a little trite. Now, my definition, is equally kind of corny, and that is, I think of legacy software as the software that you need to change that you're afraid to change, because if you weren't afraid to change it, you would just call it software, right? Like, no one's like, "Ooh, I'm excited to change this stuff, but boy, it's legacy. Let's do it," right? Like, you always have this sort of fear and this risk-driven thing. There's something wrong with it that makes you not want to address it. So that's kind of like, there's 3 or so ideas of what legacy code is, right? And the other thing that makes this kind of thinking about it urgent is that, like, here's one estimate from another analyst firm, IDC. Essentially, I don't know, about 500 million applications. I guess there's that many applications in the world. Seems like a lot. But there's a lot of legacy applications out there, right? And I guess it kind of makes sense if you think about every country, every like city and like breakup of government, that you can have. Many of those organizations have a lot of their own custom software that's been hanging around for years. So I guess it can kind of start to add up, especially if you think of little services that they rely on and things that aren't necessarily something that has a UI. You've got plenty of applications scurrying about that have been around for quite some time. So, there's a lot of legacy software out there. And we have kind of an idea of essentially what it looks like. So then, what are the kind of consequences of when you get caught in this legacy trap, right? Like, you have software that you need to change that, whether you don't have unit tests to use that basic definition, or you just sort of like don't even know what the code looks like. It doesn't, as we'll go over, there's different reasons why it's legacy stuff, but you're concerned about changing it, right? Like, what are the consequences of that, right? Now, the obvious consequence is that you slow down, right? Like you don't really have the ability to add new features to your software. Or I guess you could also think of, the another overly clever thing that old more experienced people in software always say is like, well, sometimes it's good to do less. So, you could even imagine an issue with legacy software if you're being that kind of clever, pragmatic person that like, we'd love to scale back the software that we have, but we don't know what we can take away that will break things, right? But again, that's kind of overly clever. But you get caught in this situation where you can't really modify, your software, right? Because you're afraid again to change it, and this means there's lots of negative knock-on effects to this. Is as you become more fearful of your software, we have this bad habit of kind of adding a bunch of governance and change around it, right? So we want to protect the software with this like thick, gooey, fatty layer of governance around it. And so it becomes even more inaccessible and even more difficult to change. And this leads to a more or less a compounding problem where if we're kind of afraid to touch this code, we have to go through a lot of change process to do it. Then people get very less interested in it. They don't want to be around it. Then you start losing knowledge around it, and eventually you kind of go down this spiral of everything needs to be in all caps with underscores, right? Like it's this strange, bizarre thing, even if your organization's depending on it. So it's really easy, and this is why the legacy starts to become a trap. Is it can be very difficult to escape once you've spiraled down that thing. Like it's one thing if all you need to do from our friend Michael Feathers is just add some unit tests, then you're off to the races and you can do your refactoring or whatever. But it's a whole other thing if you just don't have institutional knowledge, if you don't know who owns these services, or you don't. It's very like obtuse and hard to get into. So how does software get to this point, right? Because we're all, again, I'm sure everyone in this room very responsible. You follow all the practices so you don't manage to fall down this legacy trap. But again, your friends who aren't here, when you're talking with them and they're upset, maybe they have fallen down this trap. But I think there's many other ways, but there's three ways that software goes bad, that it falls into the trap, right? One that I already went over is that it's just, you could say it's forgotten, right? Or it's neglected. It just, and this is an odd sort of, I don't know, it's not really counterintuitive, but often the most successful software over years becomes forgotten, right? Like it works well, it doesn't have any issues, you don't really need to modify it that much. So as it is sitting there running on and on its own, you sort of go focus on other applications, other parts of the code base, and you don't really go back and visit it too much. And so this isn't always the case. It can also be that like it just wasn't that important. But oftentimes, you shift people to other parts of the code or other applications, and you kind of forget about what that code did, right? Like people might be, in the best case, promoted outside of their development role. They might go to other interesting teams, and you kind of just like this chunk of code gets left alone somewhere to be forgotten about and neglected. Now, another way that software goes bad is it has bad fitness, which is to say it's not like performant in the way that you might need. And that might mean that the kind of performance characteristics, like the speed that it executes, the way it scales out to more and more users may not work anymore. It may not comply with whatever kind of regulations or various security concerns that you have. But there's something about something that it was previously working, and there's some sort of outside change that changes the requirement for it. And historically, very historically, like a good example of this is when all of these web applications that we used to rely on all of a sudden switched to be needing to be mobile, which just gave whole different characteristics for how it needed to perform and the compatibility that it needed. And at the end, I'll go over an example where this fitness comes into account in a pharmacy example, where just the way the software was written didn't fit the new requirements for it, the new performance requirements. And then most commonly, like with the example that I had, what goes wrong is the capability doesn't work, right? Like if you think about the beach example, right? You needed the capability to do 24-hour insurance, and that just wasn't possible with the set of code that you had, the application. So you don't have the ability to add to not only add new features, but actually do new things, right? Like you can imagine in an insurance company, if you weren't selling 24-hour insurance already, that just like wouldn't exist as a type of insurance. So you would need to add that type of capability to it. So when you're looking at a piece of software, generally, when you're going to modernize it, there's 7 different ways that you're going to modernize it, 7 different avenues. Now, it's always fun to come up with something like this that all begins with the same letter, so you can be like the 7 R's or whatever. And I think this R thing started out maybe 4 or 5 years ago. There's another Gartner guy, Richard Watson, who came up with the 5 R's. And like any great idea, it's since been extended every time people go over it every few years. And I was looking over this and I was like, that looks like only 6, but then I realized there's actually 2 here for those of you who are trying to check my math. I think that adds up to 7. I have a liberal arts degree in philosophy, so numbers and I aren't very much friends. Like, we use funny Greek symbols and logic, but actual numbers, not cool. Anyhow, I'll go through these very quickly, right? And again, as I was saying earlier, the Swift methodology, this methodology of doing stuff is very methodical and disciplined, right? And so that's why it's important to kind of like do a lot of this categorization and kind of think through the type of application that you have. So first, even though it may be legacy and it might be a problem, you might actually come to the conclusion that like we're going to retain it. We'll actually do nothing. There might be something more valuable that we should do. This is good enough. Like even though it's old and seems to be crusty, like actually it's fine, right? And there's kind of a way of going through and evaluating that, again, based on the capabilities you need and if it's helping or not. Now, another great option, it's always fun, one of my favorite things to do is nothing, or stop doing things. And that's what the next option is retire, right? Like back in America, I don't know if you can tell, but I'm American. There's all the government agencies there, in particular the IRS, the tax collection agency there. It's kind of infamous for we've been around, not me, but the IRS for 80 years, like one of the first pieces of software out there, and who knows what we still use in the code base, right? There's probably a lot of applications there that really could be retired. They're just not used anymore. So then next after that, you have rehosting, right? And this is often a mixture of, it's very similar to replatform. So rehosting and replatform are a lot of what you hear about nowadays, like we're going to move to the cloud, right? And what that often means, it can mean kind of 2 things. One, sometimes rehosting is just, and replatforming is just sort of taking what you have and just moving it to a different type of infrastructure that you're running on. Like you might even do something crazy like, how about we just take what we have and stick it in some containers and then move it over there, right? Now there's also, some fun options that you get to at the end here to skip around, where not only are you moving something to the cloud or somewhere else, but you sort of conclude that we should just use some existing SaaS service for this, right? We don't want to retire this capability, but we don't really need to own this. We can just migrate it to a whole different service and rely on that. Now, the one in the middle here, maybe I should reorder this for the order that I went in. They'll do that later. But the one in the middle here, refactor and rewrite, is usually what people are thinking about when they're talking about modernizing software, right? They're thinking about let's open up the code and let's just go at it, right? And if you want to be really hair splitty, you can think about the difference between refactoring and rewriting. You go bust open your Fowler, find the parts that you highlighted, get very excited about knowing the difference between these 2 things. But essentially, we're talking about a similar sort of set of activity that's going on there. So that hints me putting it together and confusing if there's 6 or 7 here, that those are kind of similar activities. And indeed, that's kind of the type of at first when you're going through this process, you kind of figure out which of those 7 things are going to apply to you, and most of the methodology relies on speaks to that refactoring and rewriting part, right? Because that's kind of the more difficult, often more, if you'll pardon the phrase, impactful effect that you're going to have when you're modernizing. So it's also good, my co-author Mark was always good at reminding me about kind of the bigger picture for things, right? And while you're focusing on the code and refactoring things, this is also an opportunity to look through your entire, like, I don't know, stack. Not just your stack of software and hardware, but you can think of it as kind of like your meatware, right? The process and the tools and the culture that you use. And oftentimes, when you're modernizing something, it's not only that we're modernizing the application, but you're also part of an initiative of modernizing how your whole organization functions. Now, there's all sorts of modernization stuff wrapped up in there, but this is good to know for the context that you're operating in, right? You're not only typically modernizing the code or the application, but again, you'll often also be involved in modernizing how the organization functions and how the organization works. These things tend to come in big clusters, which kind of confuse and make more difficult what was once just a simple matter. But there's also a lot of advantages to be had from modernizing the way that you do software and kind of think about it in your organization. So when you're going through and thinking about what to modernize, how to modernize it, and kind of like the benefits that you want, right? There's, I told you it's great to have a list of things that all begin with the same letter, right? Here we go again. So there's kind of 6 sort of, I don't know what you'd call it, attributes or kind of benefits that you need to keep in mind when you're modernizing things, right? Because, in general, it is pleasurable to go in and just like mess around with code, but unless you've got a really awesome job, you probably would like to go home at some point. And so like it's good to have some sort of goals in mind, some attributes that you're shooting for. You could say metrics if you like to do that. But like what are some sort of characteristics that you can kind of rate your work on to see if you've achieved that goal, to figure out when you're done? Now, if you look across all of these, most of them are pretty straightforward, right? Like, it's always cool to spend less money in an organization. It's even cooler when they figure out a way to give that money back to you, which is not always the way things work. I like that. Also you want the, things like scalability and that kind of fitness that we were going over, like speed, and all sorts of stuff like that. And one that when we were writing this book, I kept trying to take out. But Mark insisted on putting back in, rightly so, was his notion of shining, right? So, and I'll spend a little bit of time on that because, if you're working on an older code base that's kind of boring and tedious and frustrating, kind of as I was saying earlier before, crusty, like that's not really fun, right? Like you don't really go into to work every day, or at least every work day, and think like, boy, I'm excited about working on this boring, tedious, difficult to change code base that no one cares about. Like, yay. So like, when you're actually modernize that software, not only is the act of modernizing it and kind of aligning it to being valuable in the organization, but you're often changing it over to new and interesting things, like you'll hear about at this conference, right? Now, some people get upset about, as they'll say, resume-driven development, or, as I would think about it, enjoying life, versus like just doing the same thing over and over again. But you really do, and we've seen this over the years, when you work with these teams who are modernizing their software, they're making their day-to-day life better, right? And they're actually improving something, and that moves them more towards the shining, kind of thriving, happy state, rather than just, being morose people who work on old stuff, which most people in technology don't really like to do. So these are characteristics, like again, as you're modernizing your applications, think about how you're meeting these and how you can use them for a goal and to rate when you're done or not. All right, so how do you go through doing modernization? Like what do you do? Well, since I focus a lot on larger organizations, the first important thing to do is to figure out what to modernize, right? And as I showed earlier, right, like if there's 500 million, let's even say 10 million. But if there's 500 million applications out there that need to be modernized, like you probably don't just want to pick a random number between 1 and 500 million and do that one, right? And it's probably also not the best idea to kind of just go off your feels about what would be a good idea to start modernizing, right? You need, in an organization, whether commercial or not, you need some way of selecting which applications are best to start with. Otherwise, you're going to like pick the wrong applications, or even worse, you're going to kind of get into a ditch of analysis paralysis where you're endlessly going to meetings and debating which application you should start with. So the way that we've approached this, I mean, of course, it has a 2x2 matrix, right? Like, I don't know about you, but I feel like all of life can be reduced to a series of 2x2 matrices. And the key to a 2x2 matrix, just as a total side note, is like if you control the axes there, you can control the outcome, which is always nice if you're find yourself confronted with a 2x2 matrix that you find offensive. Just change the axes around. But the approach that we've used over the years is that it's based on this notion that you don't want to do the hardest, most important thing first, because there's kind of an unspoken thing in a lot of the methodology that we follow, which is you kind of don't know what you're doing until you've done it, right? And so what you want to do is establish a process where you can learn what you're doing, where you can learn how your organization functions, you can learn what the old code base is, you can learn what it takes in your organization to modernize to a new code base, you can learn what you're capable of, what your team's capable of. And just like with a good sort of like design-driven kind of lean and agile approach, I don't know how many other buzzwords I can pile onto that, way of thinking about software, you're setting up an iterative, almost like often weekly cycle of of coming up with a theory, writing some code to see if that theory worked, and kind of seeing what happened, and then responding appropriately. Otherwise known as the scientific method. Has all sorts of other names that you can go through the last 100 or so years for. If you want to be really cool, you can use like the Colonel Boyd OODA loop, right? Where you're like a fighter jet pilot trying to figure out the best thing to do through this loop. Or you can use the exciting dimming lean thing of plan, do, check, act. Whatever it may be, scientific method. Probably you're familiar with that. So you want to have that approach of learning. So when it comes to legacy software, the 2x2 matrix that we use is well, nowadays we can get back to getting everyone in a room if they want to, but you get several relevant parties together, developers, infrastructure people, whatever you want to call them, business stakeholders, people who understand how the business functions. And you essentially go through an exercise where you pick out a big group of applications and you start rating the applications with that group based on the technical feasibility to modernize them, right? Which you could think of that as also the risk of failure, right? Like, so how feasible is it that we could actually do anything with this application? And then on the other axis, you talk about the importance of it. Now, to use a bunch of business jargon, this could be your business outcome or business value achieved. But it's essentially something related to how important is this going to be to my organization, right? As a business, it might be, it's very customer facing. So it's a way that we bring in revenue. If you're working at an agency, it might be something like the speed at which we can fulfill citizen requests, or whatever sort of thing is a valuable metric for your organization. So you categorize with that group, you get Post-it notes or Miro boards or whatever you like, and you go through and you kind of just rank those applications in this matrix. Now, if you've ever done an exercise like this, what always happens is mysteriously, all of the applications are in the upper right-hand corner because, of course, to someone they're all valuable and you need to do them. So what you would do in that case, whenever you're in a situation like that, is you take your tape and you go up there and you place it back over that cluster of apps and you go through the exercise again until eventually you end up with just a little cluster of applications. So what you found there are applications, again, they may not be the most important or the most difficult, but they do have some value, some business value to them. And they also seem pretty low risk as far as your ability to update them, right? And again, think about the reason that you're doing this is you're focused on how can we start to learn how to do this? How can we make sure that in the long term we're successful because we've learned how to do it and we haven't just sort of like also in learning, when inevitably we don't do the right thing, we haven't brought the business down, right? But then equally, it's also important to actually pick real applications. Like you don't want to like say like, oh man, we should pick a conference room scheduling application. Like, that's not really very critical to anything, except scheduling conferences, right? But you want to pick something that actually is used by the business because, you know, one of the other things you're going to be doing, not only in learning how to do this, but you're also going to need to build internally, uh, basically justifying that you should keep doing it. Whether that means getting more budget, getting more permissions, winning over the trust of other people. So it's really important that you have something that is a real application that you can learn from, that also builds trust in the rest of the organization to do the next application, and then the 15th application, and the 20th, and so forth and so on, kind of building up that momentum that it works well. So then, once you pick an application, and you know, if you want to read more in detail, you can check out the book that we have, and there's also kind of learning courses online you can check out as well. But what the Swift methodology does is it takes that application, and again, in a very like what I would consider, based on the way I used to do software development, a very rigorous way of going through this. And I'll go through an example that kind of walks through this. Is you take the application, and again, it always starts with a room, whether real or virtual, full of people. But you go through and you figure out, all right, never mind the actual code of this application, or you do mind it, but let's not get locked into that mindset. Let's think about what this application is doing. And let's use you know, some domain-driven design thinking to basically break out the flows of what people are doing in the application, to find the domains. We can use event storming as a sort of probe to go through that. And then what we're going to end up with is basically not so much requirements, but like what this application is supposed to do. And then also how we would break that application into kind of subcomponents. I'm obviously not a DDD person because I'm using a bunch of weird hand-wavy language. But it is a great methodology to break up the architecture, right? So what we're trying to do with that methodology is come up with the ideal architecture for the application regardless of what it currently does. We have a goal to shoot for. So you pick out one of these kind of, one of these thin slices, one of these, one of the functions in the application, and you start by modernizing that, right? So you're not even modernizing the entire application. And then usually on a week-by-week basis, you go through and you make little changes to this application. Again, going through this learning process and observing each time until you finish out with that slice, and then you select another slice, right? And so you're getting smarter and wiser and more skilled as you go through this. Again, well, not again, but just to call it out, as opposed to what I commonly see in large organizations. I just heard this a couple months ago where someone said, well, they were working for a big government agency. By March of 2024, we're going to have modernized and moved 60% of our applications to the public cloud. And you know, you ask like which ones, and they're like 60% of them. And so like, you know, like when you have like that long-term schedule and a goal like that, you're just assuming that it's going to work, which, as you know, is a terrible assumption to make in computers. So let me go through an example to kind of show you what this looks like finally here. So as I mentioned earlier, this is an example from a pharmacy company. And what happened with them, and this is, you know, the kind of pharmacy that people like you and I would go to. Well, we need some medicine. We need to fill a prescription. You go there and you're like, I need my stuff. And then they give you the medicine. And it's back in the States, so it's a little more less streamlined and weird and complicated with all the parties you have to deal with. But the issue that they were facing was the fitness one. So this was back, you know, during the COVID times, where, as you can imagine, the capabilities and the performance characteristics that a pharmacy needed like completely changed, right? Like normally you would go in there and get your refill, or you drive up there. It's an exciting feature that most all American pharmacies have, where you just drive up there. You can get a burger and pills, not at the same place, but on the same trip. It'd be awesome if you could get it at the same place, or maybe it'd be terrible. I'm not sure. But you know, they needed to not only support a huge influx of refilling medicine online, but also, if you're familiar with omni-channel retail, I think there's like, I don't know, 8 to 9 different modes of doing retail across all the combinations, right? So, for example, you can always do in store. Someone just walks in the store, gets the thing. You can do like, I ordered it online, I'm going to pick it up in store. You could say like, I ordered it online, I'm going to return it at the store, so forth and so on, right? Like you think of all the combinations of in-person, online, pick up, return. You've got a huge array of basically paying for and getting a thing. So basically the software the pharmacy was using at the pharmacy desk wasn't fit for the purpose or the capabilities that they needed. So they needed to modernize this application. So they went through that 2x2 process, right? Where they had, all the relevant, maybe some irrelevant people too, but they had the relevant people, and this was online, hence it's captured very nicely here. Look at those great drop shadows and things. But they went online and they thought about, okay, so just the act of, let's say, getting a prescription refill. What's everything that happens from a person needs a prescription refill to they have it, right? And what's all the software that we need to support that? And you can see, going through the process of breaking it up, there's kind of these different areas and different things that need to happen. I mean, you can imagine this is where like being a programmer gets fun, right? Because you get to like infinitesimally break everything up into small components. Like you don't just go into a pharmacy and get a prescription. You got to like, are they authorized to get this? Like which kind of insurance that they have, and can I check that? And then how do I allocate the costs? And then I've got to go back and once I give them the prescription, I've got to update my inventory so I can get more of those pills. I wish people did that more for the pills that I get, because I'm always going in there and they're like, come back in 2 days. Anyways, that's like the point of a pharmacy, I think, is to have the stuff. It's also very bad for me, because like any good programmer, I'm always late in my estimates of when I need to go pick them up. Or maybe not you all, but programmers I know do that. So you can see you break it up into all these tasks, right? So if we were to go and modernize all of this at once, my prediction is it wouldn't be fun. Like it wouldn't turn out well to have that entire scope have multiple teams doing things. So instead, following the process, they start to like look at all those functions and kind of slice them up into different domains, like different systems that they could start working on, right? And so obviously you're going to need to have ways of interacting between the existing and the new code, have some kind of all your clean separations and things like that. But once you get to this point, you can kind of go through and start to pick one part that you'll start modernizing, right? Again, you can start with a small scope and start to learn and not only learn how to do it, but actually do quite a bit of the work. So you can see they've broken it out into these little areas here that are related with each other. And then you end up picking some of those flows to go through, right? And so what happens here, as you can imagine, is a couple of things. One is that you now know the system a lot better, right? Because previously, a lot of the problem with legacy software, as we went over, is that people don't really know so much how it works, right? And not only do they not know how the code works, I don't know if you've ever been in this kind of conversation, but you're like, I don't really understand why this exists. Like, what point is this thing serving? And why did we do things this way? And why am I having to deal with it? Right? And so, I was joking that sometimes what you do is you eliminate software, right? You eliminate code. And once you have this, kind of deeper understanding of what's actually required, like this is much better than a requirements document that, you might have found by searching around on some SharePoint site. And you're like, I don't know if _v201_final is actually the final one, but you've got this better understanding of what your system actually does. And with that, you can kind of go through and you can start to modernize little slices of it, and you get a much better, very much so risk control way of eventually getting to the point where you've updated the system, right? And again, thinking back to those goals, those S's that you have, you can kind of rate the success as you go through it. You've got really a disciplined way of doing this beyond just like, it needs to be modernized, and I'll see you in 6 months. Right? Like you've got a process in place that will work much better. Now, that's like one, I guess you could think of it as application, but one part, right? Like if you remember in most organizations I talk with, there's like hundreds or thousands of applications, right? And the way that these organizations tend to work is they pick that one application, that one domain, they break it into small parts. And as I was kind of alluding to with building up trust, is as they've learned how to do something, they have a very deliberate strategy where they're slowly scaling up to more and more applications, right? They're documenting the process that they do. They're using this process as a learning mechanism to find applications. And they do more and more of the applications across the portfolio. And this similar pattern applies to all sorts of ways of transforming or doing IT in a new way. And I like to go over it in particular because the expectation I like to set here is like, however fast you think you're going to do things is a bad idea, right? You probably are going to do half or maybe even a third of what you were told to do initially, right? If you remember back to like, we're going to move 60% of applications to the public cloud in less than 12 months, like that's not a good idea, right? Like you're just setting yourself up to do too much. So you really want to, before you decide you're going to transform all these applications all at once, maybe try for 3 months and see what rate you actually do things at and what difficulties you're going to have or how easy, maybe you can do 70% of the applications, but you have no idea how long things will actually take. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an overview of how you can kind of methodically think through modernizing a large portfolio of software. You can get that booklet for free. There's all sorts of things that you can do. I don't know. There's other stuff up there if you're interested in my inane stuff. But, if you're faced with like dealing with modernizing applications in a large organization, I think it's good to have a system to start with. And that's just like when you're modernizing the application itself, you can start with this Swift methodology. And if it doesn't work for you, you can modify it and change things around as well. And as a bonus, if you go to the link, that legacy trap link, there's also a link to this thing doing a developer toil audit, which is an interesting way to discover process legacy stuff, if you will. It's essentially just a way of going out and here's a shocker. I don't know if you developers types have been asked this very much, but like, has anyone ever asked you like what's annoying in your day-to-day work? That's exactly what a developer toil audit does. And hopefully someone like reads it and does something about it. So thanks. I appreciate the chance to talk with y'all and enjoy the rest of the conference.